almost 65 years, since my mid-teens, I have studied and followed biology. But only recently have I come to appreciate one of biology's most probing and perplexing questions. Where in the biological hierarchy does evolution happen? Evolutionary's primary driver is natural selection. And natural selection is determined by fitness to survive and reproduce. It sounds simple, but here's the deep question. Where is that natural selection actually taking place? What is it whose fitness determines survival and reproduction? The question is called the units or levels of selection, and the possibilities are many, but not only many, also astonishingly across vast differences of sizes. Consider the range. Individual genes, DNA molecules, are measured in nanometers. Then, progressively larger groups of genes, cells, organs, organisms, individuals, kinships, populations, species. The range is indeed vast. Is there a single winner, say the selfish gene, as Richard Dawkins famously advocates? Or are there challengers? It's a key question in evolutionary biology. What are the units or levels of evolutionary selection? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and closer to truth is my journey to find out. The question is fundamental biology. Where does natural selection take place? In other words, what is the thing or unit that is being selected for naturally? And what is the level of that thing or unit in the biological hierarchy? The fury of expert argument is revelatory. Evolutionary biologists debating the units or levels of selection, defending opposing positions. I like the debate because it forces me to address where natural selection makes its evolutionary magic. I can begin in only one place, with the author of the book, The Selfish Gene That Galvanized the Field, evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins. Richard, why did your book, The Selfish Gene, published in 1976, make such an extraordinary impact on the thinking in evolutionary biology? And I'd like to start by understanding the conventional wisdom at that time.
The wisdom that I was opposing was the group selection fallacy. The idea that animals work for the good of the species, the good of the group, to propagate the species, keep it going, that kind of thing. That's wrong. And I wanted to write a book to give the truth. And I soon realized that actually the level at which selection acts is the gene. Animals work to survive in the first place and then to reproduce, and reproduction means propagating genes. And at the time, I was very inspired by the work of W.D. Hamilton on kin selection, the way animals work for the good of their kin, their family, their nephews and nieces and things. And the easiest way by far to understand that is in terms of the gene. Genes work for their own survival, and they work through individuals. I call them in The Selfish Gene, I call them survival machines. So individuals are survival machines. They carry the genes around with them that built them, that programmed them, and that made them do the things that they do. And in particular, I was interested in altruism at the level of the individual. Altruistic individuals are programmed by selfish genes.
In recent times, the perception is that some of the multi-level selection ideas have been coming back in terms of the gene level, the individual, the group, the species, and et cetera. So is that a correct perception of what's happening?
It is correct in the sense that if you talk to quite a lot of biologists, they'll say it's correct. I don't think it is. I mean, I don't think it's helpful at all. It's not the same thing as the group selection that I was attacking. Yeah. When you look at it, when you analyze it carefully, it turns out to be either kin selection or reciprocal altruism. And if you go to the level of the gene, you get the right answer every time. You don't need anything else.
Richard's The Selfish Gene certainly framed the debate, and the gene, as the unit or level of selection, became the new standard model. So why didn't the selfish gene settle the debate? What questions were unresolved? What issues remained open? I speak with a philosopher of science and biology whose analytical scalpel dissects the units or levels of selection, Elizabeth Lloyd.
There are 4 different questions actually being pursued under the one name, the units of selection. A unit of selection can mean the long-term beneficiary of a evolution by selection process. That's what Dawkins means. He says, I'm not talking about a vehicle, I'm talking about a replicator, but it turns out he doesn't mean any replicator, he means the long-term beneficiary of an evolution by selection process. A standard approach is the original one, that distinction that he made between what he called a vehicle, but what nowadays is called an interactor, which is the phenotype or the trait that exists at whatever level, that it makes a difference to whatever replicators or reproducers it includes. It interacts in a direct way and in a cohesive way with the environment in such a way that replication or reproduction is differential. That goes for groups, that goes for species, that goes for alleles. It goes all the way up and down the entire biological
To different
hierarchy.
degrees as they interact.
Yes. And in fact, as you go up and down, the reproducer changes, the reproducer facilitating the conduct from one generation to the next to pass the trait on. And reproducer includes the developmental phases of that heredity. And it includes the replicator in it. So you've got 2 ideas there. You've got the interactor and the reproducer. I noticed, though, that there's something wrong with that distinction of having only 2 things. You need also a manifester of an engineering adaptation. By engineering adaptation, I mean an adaptation that accumulates like a mechanism that answers to an environmental problem. It accumulates over time through a selection process to respond to an environmental
And
change.
that's different than changes in the replicator or interactor?
It's additional to it. You have to have an interactor interacting with the environment in order to have a selection.
Right, that's it.
And
You have to have
you
something
have
that
to have the
replicates.
reproducer, and you have to have the accumulation of a mechanism on top of it. That's what makes a manifester of adaptation.
Lisa has 4 categories for the units or levels of selection, each with its own question. Replicator, what reproduces? Interactor, what interfaces with the environment? Manifester of adaptation, what accumulates new traits? And beneficiary, what ultimately benefits? By teasing apart distinct aspects of what it means to be a unit or level of selection, she both enriches the debate and opens it up. How do Lisa's 4 categories function? The first 2, replicator and interactor, are the most prominent. But does everyone accept them? I meet a philosopher of science and biology who has focused on the philosophical foundations of evolution, Peter Godfrey-Smith.
Richard Dawkins started quite a lot of this in his book, The Selfish Gene. He talked about genes as replicators, and he saw them as the sort of fundamental agents in evolution. Everything really takes place at that level. But of course, there's lots that genes can't do. They don't actually live and die in a way that is the sort of overt business of the evolutionary process. So he introduced the word vehicles for organisms like us. We're vehicles in which replicators reside, and we're programmed by the replicators. The idea of a vehicle as a kind of mere secondary player was resisted by some people in the next round of discussion. And David Hull in particular, one of the first philosophers to really get involved in this, he modified both concepts. He had replicators in a similar way to Dawkins, and interactors was his replacement for the vehicle concept. So you and I are interactors. We interact with the environment and with each other, and do so in a way that affects the replication rate, the fitness of our replicators within. A lot of work was guided by that framework. So you find the things being copied, and you find the things whose activities affect the copying rate of the replicators. For example, can groups of organisms, as well as individual organisms, be interactors in some cases? Now, I think the whole framework was not set up right. And I argue that the simpler three-part formulation of how evolution works, in which you just have a collection of things that reproduce and where there's variation, heredity, and differences in reproductive success or output, that simpler picture is superior to the more complicated replicator-interactor picture. So genes are only really minor players in terms of their immediate effects, and so the interactor or vehicle concept was introduced to kind of complement and make sense of the primacy of the genes. But I don't believe in the primacy of the genes in that sense.
How many different levels or units of selection have intelligent philosophers of biology argued for?
Lots. It's not so much the philosophers who've made cases for surprising possible levels. It is more of a debate within biology. So, for example, it's possible to think that a mated pair or a mating pair, a tiny group of two, that can be a group or a special kind of unit above the level of the organism. It's possible to think that all the genes in your body derive from one parent rather than the other parent, sort of have a kind of integrity as a unit themselves.
Isn't there an overarching idea that says, yeah, why are you fighting? They're all true in a different sense.
I don't think they're all true. If you're saying that human groups or societies function in an evolutionary process at their level, then you're saying that there's variation, there's some kind of reproduction relationship.
You need all those characteristics.
You need all those characteristics.
At each of those levels to make the argument.
That's right. Often I think it's not so much that the characteristics are completely absent from a level a person might be interested in, but they're so kind of degraded or weakly present that any effect that they might have gets swamped by the effects of what happens at other levels. I think that's common.
Okay, so you have this multitude of levels. Give me your argument again for why you see this Darwinian population as really subsuming the whole thing.
It's the right form of description to apply at all the levels that might matter. So to ask whether genes are units of selection, you should ask, do genes make up a Darwinian population? And quite often they do, because they replicate, they reproduce, some genes are copied more than others, and they vary. So yes, chromosomes sometimes count, and you apply the same test both times. Organisms, parts of organisms, insect colonies, human groups. A guiding principle of my work here is that there is a fairly simple test that should be applied uniformly in each case, as opposed to the interactors serving the replicators in a sort of master-slave picture that I think was somewhat misguided.
To Peter, the key unit of selection is simply a Darwinian population, a collection of things, whether genes or organisms or groups, that can undergo change via natural selection among variations. And a Darwinian population can occur at various levels. But irrespective of whatever is the unit of selection, I wonder what gives it the capacity to be Darwinian and change via natural selection. I ask a holistic philosopher of science and biology, Paul Griffiths.
The units of selection debate started out in quite a bad place, I think, because everybody was arguing about the idea of the selfish gene, which was a very kind of politicized idea. A lot of people were convinced that whether the unit of selection is fundamentally the individual gene or the whole organism was relevant to the question of whether people are essentially selfish or essentially altruistic. Yeah. And later philosophical work showed that that is just completely confused.
Yeah, I agree.
People differ on how significant or frequent selection acting at particular levels of organization is likely to be. There's one idea of selfish genes that absolutely everybody agrees on, which is that there are elements in the genome which replicate themselves independently of the rest of the genome and independently of what's good for the rest of the genome. My own work has not really been about whether selection's happening at the level of the gene, the organism, or the group of organisms, like, say, an ant's nest or a beehive. It's been more about what is that unit at each level. If there's a tiny piece of DNA which is a unit of selection, how should we think about that tiny piece of DNA? And in particular, if you think that an organism is a unit of selection, how should you think about an organism? And I like...
So that claim is that there are, at each level, a unit of selection.
Exactly, and I think of the things that exist at each level more holistically and inclusively than many other people do. So if we think about an organism, I don't think about an organism as a chunk of meat that makes copies of itself. I think of it as a process from birth to death, which is supported by a wide range of resources, which in the human case contains everything from genes to the existence of a community of language users. And all these things are required for that process to be reconstructed again and again over evolutionary time. And I think of those processes as more or less successful in giving rise to more of themselves in future. So it's a systems, inclusive, holistic systems perspective of the units of evolution, but if there are units of evolution at the genetic level, then I want to think about what's actually required for those things to propagate over time. I don't try to integrate all the levels of selection into one big holistic theory of evolution. I try to take a much more broader systems level perspective on evolution at each level.
Paul's holistic approach to the units or levels of selection means that it is not so much which is the correct unit or level, but rather what is it about each unit or level that drives the selection process. Even so, I'm still puzzled by the vast disparity in sizes among the different levels of the units of selection. I speak with a philosopher credited for his careful and penetrating analysis of natural selection and evolution, Elliott.
It all started with Darwin, who mostly thought about natural selection as a process in which individual organisms in the same species compete with each other, some out-surviving and out-producing the others, and the result is the evolution of traits that help organisms to survive and reproduce, called that individual selection. But he realized that there are some traits that he thought could not be explained in that way, but were nonetheless adaptive. Not adaptive for the individual that has the trait, but adaptive for the group in which the individual belongs. An example that Darwin talks about in The Origin of Species is the existence of sterile workers in social insects. It doesn't do the sterile organism any good to be sterile, but if it's a worker and contributes to the building of the nest, then nests that contain sterile workers will do better than nests that do not. So it's the advantage of the group. Mm-hmm. In his book on human evolution, The Descent of Man, he talks about human morality as evolving by a process of group selection, where groups that have an ethos of cooperation will outcompete groups that do not have an ethos of cooperation. He talks about human warfare as a battle between groups and groups where individuals are prepared to lay down their lives or risk their lives for the sake of the group. And the result of that is, at the level of competition among groups, some groups survive, others go extinct. The idea that group and individual selection are both legitimate hypotheses radically changed in the 1960s when the idea of group selection came under attack, not just because it was supposed to be factually mistaken, but in a more radical sense, the critics thought that there was something fundamentally misguided about it. The popular version of this was Dawkins' book in '76, The Selfish Gene. Then there was a resurgence of interest, a counterpunch, as it were, and it became a controversy about what the status is of group selection. I myself believe group selection is a legitimate hypothesis. I think there's data to show that it has occurred. The question is, where's the causal action? Is it groups competing with groups, individuals with individuals? There's a third wrinkle, which is maybe looking inside of a single organism, you see genes competing with each other for representation in the next generation. This is a very weird idea because the received view until then was the point of genes is to cooperate with each other to help build a healthy, happy, reproductive organism.
Right.
But there are examples of genes that subvert the ability of other genes to make their way in the next generation. That was a shock.
What's the current status of group selection?
I think now there's a much larger number of knowledgeable scientists who regard it as a legitimate hypothesis. So at the level of individuals, selfishness beats altruism. At the level of groups, an altruistic group will do better than a selfish group. Let's see if
Elliott defends group selection as a legitimate level of natural selection, recognizing, of course, the level of the gene as well. If so, wouldn't the conundrum of the size disparity of levels disappear? Multiple units at different levels would seem sensible for where selection actually takes place. Why then the continuing heat of debate? I ask a philosopher who specializes in units or levels of selection, Samir Okasha.
There is indeed a hierarchy of opinions or a range of opinions, and so it excited much debate and led to much confusion. To give a flavour of what the issue really is, suppose one's studying an earthworm, and you notice that the earthworm has got this amazing physiology that enables it to burrow through the soil. And you think to yourself, well, why is that? I mean, why has it got that? And suppose then a biologist gives you the following answer. They say, well, look, the earthworm's physiology allows it to burrow through the soil, and that aerates the soil, and that benefits local microbes in the local environment, and that is good for the local ecosystem, and that's why the earthworms do it. Now, what's wrong with that answer? I mean, all of the facts stated are true, but the point is that's not why earthworms do it. So to achieve a genuine understanding of that from a Darwinian perspective, you've got to be able to prove advantage to the individual earthworm, not to some larger collective of which it's a part, or so the orthodoxy has it. However, there are certain circumstances where it is legitimate to think in terms of selection and adaptation at that higher level. For example, if one envisaged a process of Darwinian evolution between ecosystems, rather than between earthworms within one ecosystem. Between earthworms within one ecosystem, we should surely expect earthworms to behave in ways that benefit them, not some collective. But if we imagine as well, or instead, a process of evolution taking place at a higher level, pitting some ecosystems against other. So the general point is that one has to, when giving a Darwinian explanation, attend carefully to the question of whether one is postulating advantage at an individual level or a group level, and to be careful not to postulate advantage at a group level if the selective process one has in mind is competition between individuals rather than groups.
And how do you sort that out?
Well, in part by attending carefully to that logical point that if we have a process of natural selection operating on individuals, we shouldn't expect that to benefit larger entities rather than those individuals themselves. But that's not the whole story. I've tried to achieve a clean separation of the conceptual questions from the empirical ones, because sometimes when evolutionists argue about the level of selection or the level of adaptation, they appear to be asking an empirical question about how something evolved. But other times they appear to be asking a question that's not directly empirical, as for example when Dawkins says we should think of the gene as the unit of selection, not the individual organism. By his own admission, he's not advancing a new empirical theory, but rather offering a new take on the existing theory. So that conceptual empirical separation is critical.
Is the levels of selection controversy getting worse or getting better? Or
It seems to
people
be-
are just getting tired of it?
Well, people get tired of it, but then a new generation come along and they reinvent the wheel. And so this is one of those debates that never seems to go away. The debate on this within the science looks more like philosophy in that it never seems to get resolved.
To understand life on Earth, to appreciate human beings, we must assess the units of selection. In other words, at what level or levels in the biological hierarchy does natural selection make its evolutionary magic?
The level at which selection acts is the gene.
The gene is the level at which selection works. Genes work for their own survival. Genes are selfish. They work through individuals, and group selection is not valid.
There are 4 different questions.
There is not one, but 4 critical questions. What replicates? What interacts? What manifests adaptation? What is the beneficiary? A simpler story is a collection of things that reproduces a Darwinian population with variation, heredity, and differences in reproductive success.
I don't try to integrate.
Alternatively, ask what is it about each unit or level that empowers the selection?
I myself believe group selection is a
Group selection is valid. At the level of individuals, selfishness beats altruism. At the level of groups, altruism beats selfishness.
To achieve a genuine understanding.
To discern the units of selection, distinguish the empirical from the conceptual. In the end, to focus on what unit, at what level, natural selection makes that evolutionary magic is to bring us closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.